So, sir, thanks for joining us today on Leadership Log, which is a podcast for the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center community on topics of interest. And the topic of interest today is speaking with our AFLCMC historian, Kevin Rusnak, to learn about the significance of this date. So typically when we film these things, we do them in advance and then air them at a later date. But today is actually October 20th that we're recording this, and we're doing it on this day because this date is significant. And so, sir, if you could start off, just tell us why October 20 matters.
Yes, sir. Thank you for inviting me here, first of all. But yeah, today's a big deal because it's a 100th anniversary. We historians, of course, like anniversaries. It's a good kind of hook to get bits of our history and heritage out. So why October 20th, 2022, or 1922, as it were? Well, this was the day that, at least in the U.S., that the first parachute save was made using a modern type parachute. What does that mean? That's what we think of as a free fall ripcord operated parachute. You think about somebody skydiving now, they jump out of an airplane, they got their parachute in a pack on their back, they pull a cord, it opens up and they float safely to Earth. Well, on this date 100 years ago was the first time that was done, possibly in the world, as far as we know, to successfully save an aviator, and this was an Army Air Service pilot, from certain death because his airplane was crashing. There had been many test jumps doing these, of course, and we'll get to that story a little bit later. But this was the first time that such a parachute was used in an actual situation to actually save somebody's life, and that's going to be our story this morning.
Okay, so let's set the stage. So 1922, we were in Dayton at McCook Field. But the organization that existed at that time was the engineering division. Is that correct? And
that is correct, yes.
And how does that relate to today? We have Air Force Research Laboratory and the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, the two main organizations here at Wright-Pat, headquartered here at Wright-Pat. So explain kind of the relationship between those and that.
Yeah, it's you're very much correct there. The what was by this time called the engineering division, it had several different names since it had been established as really a significant organization in 1917. It was the Airplane Engineering Department, the Airplane Engineering Division, Aircraft Engineering, these kinds of things, but it settled on the engineering division. It performed basically the functions of, as you said, the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center and the Air Force Research Lab. Well, what are those functions? So everything from not quite a lot of science, but kind of technology, research and development through acquisition and tests to get aircraft and equipment that goes on the aircraft and associated with airplanes out to the user command. So they did both the kind of R&D, the test, and the acquisition piece. This was all rolled into one big organization. They had, of course, the laboratories that would do experimentation. They might be working on new materials or photographic equipment, new types of propellers and engines, aerodynamic testing and wind tunnels, all those things that like the Air Force Research Laboratory does today. But then on the flip side of that, they're also testing design. They're putting out specifications for new types of aircraft. So if the higher levels of the Air Service decide, okay, we need X number of new pursuit planes, what we think of as fighters today. Then the people at McCook Field would say, okay, well, here are the specifications we're looking for. They would put those out to industry. They would evaluate designs. Industry would actually build a prototype. They would send those first one or two prototypes to McCook Field where they would be tested, both structurally, like they would be put inside a large hangar and have sandbags loaded up on various parts to make sure that they could meet the loads, the stress tests they called them, to make sure the wings wouldn't break under under certain loads, or the tails wouldn't break, that kind of thing. And then they would also be flight tested. And so you're doing a lot of that kind of thing. And as part of that, we had a group of test pilots here. So in that sense, we were also doing the functions of what you see out at Edwards Air Force Base today. There was no Edwards Air Force Base. It was all that flight testing was done here at McCook Field. So we were really kind of a one-stop shop, kind of from beginning to end until we got things out in the field. And then once those aircraft were approved, if they passed the test, okay, this design is good, it meets our qualifications, then the group here would put those out for bid, saying, okay, hey, here's this design. This was a little bit of a weird acquisition process, at least compared to what we're used to today. They would get these, they would solicit these designs, and different companies would submit their designs along with these prototypes. We would evaluate them. We would pick the best one. There might be, say, 3 options. We pick option number 1. Well, the government would own that design. And we would take that and say, okay, now we're going to put this design out for bid. So say if a company like Martin came up with a winning design, Martin wouldn't necessarily get to build those airplanes. We would take that, the government owned it, as I said, then we would put those out for bid, saying, okay, who can build this type of airplane to these plans, for the least amount of money? And they weren't so concerned with today, like, could they actually do this or not? There's a lot of, that wasn't really so much of a criteria. It was just whoever was the lowest bidder, essentially, because in the post-World War I period, there was very, very little money going into the U.S. military, and the Air Service was certainly no exception to that. So they were worried about cost savings. So what might happen is you would have Martin design an airplane, and then another company, say Boeing or Thomas More, somebody like that, put in the lowest bid, and so they would get that production lot. They would actually get to build the first 20 or 50 of these it's usually a small number at this point, but say 20 airplanes. And then so they would build that. If the Air Service decided they needed 20 more, they would put those out for bid again, and a different company might build that. So you might actually have the same type of airplane built by 2 or 3 different companies, and that was designed by yet a third company. So it was a little bit of an odd thing, but this was all handled at McCook Field. They would let the contracts and do all these things that LCMC does today, after they had settled with that. And then, of course, they would do some service testing to make sure these things could run appropriately for the right amount of time and so forth. And this was also true for all the components that would go into it, including parachutes that were kind of the subject of our discussion today.
Yeah. And so we'll talk a little bit about the geography of it. So McCook Field, where this was happening at that time, is really kind of in the heart of Dayton. And it even was then at that time. Wright-Patterson, which is on the outskirts of Dayton, and a less populated, even still a little less populated than certainly being downtown Dayton. But at that time, it was much more less populated than it was downtown. And so they were doing that flight testing over what was essentially a medium-sized city. What was Dayton at that time?
Yeah, it's fair to call it a medium-sized city. It was certainly, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, it was more significant than it was today. It was very kind of growing, burgeoning industrial city. It was very much known for technology development, manufacturing. It was that kind of, early sort of industrial age, early 20th century city. It was on the move. It was growing. We had some major corporations here, particularly the National Cash Register, or NCR. That was the big one in Dayton. They made the most famous and certainly the most numerous cash registers used all around the world, because they were the first to kind of develop this automatic cash register where you could push the buttons to push in an amount and how much they were paid, and it would calculate, the change and all those kinds of things. You would find these literally around the world. And that's, no joke. I was in, a few years ago, I was in Slovakia, and saw on the window of a candy store, there was an NCR cash register sitting right there. So I had to snap a picture, because there, goes back to Dayton, Ohio. And that's what made the richest families in Dayton got rich, because of the National Cash Register Company. And in fact, Wright-Patterson owns half of its namesake to that family, the Patterson family. Because the company was started by 2 brothers, the Pattersons. One of them, the elder who actually had died by this point, it was his son, Frank Stewart Patterson, who ended up being a test pilot here, that actually died on the modern day Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, that land. And then later on, when we're getting ahead of the story a bit, but later on, that part of the field became named Patterson Field, and then the half that's now Area B was called Wright Field. But this happens in the 1930s, and so that namesake, the Patterson family, that goes back to these NCR days, still lives. That legacy still lives with us today in our name.
Yeah, and so we tie back to the significance of McCook Field, because this story and probably others are part of the reason why this function eventually migrated to the outskirts of Dayton because at that time, McCook Field being downtown, it was a very small area. There were houses right up onto the border of it. And we were doing flight testing right over the top of that. And which, in hindsight is probably part of the reason that we now do flight testing out at Edwards Air Force Base in the desert, where if anything goes wrong, there's plenty of space for something to go wrong. So let's start talking about the story now today that happened on October 20th.
Yeah, for sure. If I can get to your first point a little bit, just to provide some geographical context, it's important to remember that McCook Field was actually never supposed to be there. That was entirely happenstance, and that ends up being a little bit of its downfall. Is this kind of historical oddity? We had a few months earlier, the first military aviation facility in Dayton was on the modern day Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That was what they called Wilbur Field, and that's now part of Area A, and that includes Huffman Prairie, which the Wright brothers had used for their flight testing. And so that was established in the summer of 1917 as a training facility for pilots and armorers for airplanes and mechanics. And attached to that was something called the Fairfield Air Depot. And that was kind of the supply center for all of the air service schools that were in our geographic region. So all the airplane bits and pieces that were assembled on factories around the Midwest would get shipped by train to there and then sent from there out to the various schools, including Wilbur Wright Field. So that was number one. And so originally we were doing some flying there. McCook Field came along a few months later. Early October is when we kind of signed the lease for that of 1917. But originally, what was going to be the engineering division, we'll just call it that to keep things simple for our conversation, that was actually going to be at Langley Field out in Virginia, the modern day Langley Air Force Base, or the Langley Research Center for what's now NASA. We were going to put that there. And those were the guys that were going to do these things that I described earlier. They're going to do mainly testing and what they called engineering experimentation. So it's kind of like, hey, we're verifying, what contractors say their airplanes can do or their engines can do. We're testing propellers and all of that. We were going to go stick that out at Langley because that was already an active base and it had been for some time. The trouble was when they tried to put it out there, they were having trouble finding workers to work there. They didn't have the sort of industrial capacity and sort of legacy of industry like Dayton did. So that was number one. They couldn't find enough people to work there. But number two, they were trying to build essentially permanent facilities there. Okay, hey, we're going to do this construction, so we're going to build, large brick hangars and lots of steel and all of that. Well, that bogged down, and meanwhile, we're trying to fight a war in Europe. So they decided, and this is the kind of the equipment division of the Air Service, that hey, we need something faster. We need a place that's accessible to the industry that's building airplanes and components, and has the people that can go to work right away. So where can we do that? Well, one of the people on this equipment division, these are the people that are overseeing this, that are deciding, what kind of airplanes to buy, essentially kind of like the Air Force Materiel Command today, but there were civilians partly, or at least civilians who had turned into kind of reserve military guys. They looked around, and one of those guys happened to be a Daytonian named Edward Deeds. And he had worked for NCR. He was an engineer, but he had his own companies by this point. He was also one of the wealthiest guys in Dayton. But he had said that, well, you know what, why don't you guys consider Dayton? Because we have all of these great companies there. We have a highly qualified technical workforce. And you know what? The Wright brothers had already proven that we can do airplane things there. We've opened this Wilbur Wright Field, so there's airplane stuff going on. And I can send you guys a map of this, but there's a map that shows Dayton with the arrows going out to all these different cities like Pittsburgh and Indianapolis and Detroit that show how close it is to this industrial heartland of the U.S. So that's where you want a place that's kind of centrally located if they're going to be doing this sort of engineering and technology. So while Deeds he wasn't in charge of that decision, he had at least made that recommendation. So the Army Air Service sent a group of people out to Dayton to go check out some facilities. The first thing they looked at was a place south of town in Moraine, modern day suburb of Dayton. For those of you who are listening who aren't from Dayton, and there was an aircraft plant there that had been constructed or converted just to build airplanes for World War I. And actually, Edward Deeds had helped start that as well. And so the initial plan was to put McCook Field next to that. And in fact, Deeds himself had a private airfield there that he called South Field. That was actually going to be the site, and that was a little bit already kind of an experimental field. That's where they would, the Dayton Wright people and Deeds himself, that's where they would do some of this experimentation. And so the Army thought, okay, great, we'll go ahead and take that over. Well, at the last second, literally while the people are here in town, Deeds has a change of heart. He's like, well, I don't really want to give up my private airfield there. We might still need that for this Dayton Wright company that's building airplanes. However, we do have this other facility that's just north of downtown, which again, Deeds had opened several months earlier. He had planned to establish a training school there. And that was this little pocket of land. It's almost like a crescent shape, just north of downtown, north of the Great Miami River. Again, it's easier to tell with a map, but it was essentially a flat floodplain. There wasn't very much there. It was surrounded by houses on about a half or 2/3 of it, and then the river on kind of the other third, with downtown on one side, neighborhoods on the other. But it was small. It was small, but it had two advantages. One, that they had already tried to do a little bit of flying there, so there were some hangars. Secondly, it was available. They could go ahead and get this land and start building, as soon as they sign the lease for it. So the Army checked that out. They're like, okay, not perfect, but you know what? This facility is going to be temporary. Just like all these schools were opening up for pilots around the country, this is going to be open for the duration of the war. And then we're going to go ahead and move everything back to Langley Field and those permanent facilities. So sure, we'll do that. So they signed the lease. It was, I think, October 4th or 5th, something like that, of 1917. And literally construction starts the next day. And then so by early December, within 2 months, McCook Field's up and running in this little patch of land. So they're throwing up hangars, they're throwing up buildings for kind of laboratories, administrative functions. There's a lot of different things going on there, but basically that's where they're going to put the test stands and do some flying. At this point, they're flying single-engine biplanes. There's maybe a handful of 2-engine airplanes from Europe. There are no American 2-engine airplanes at this time, so you didn't really need a whole lot of land. So it's something like 250 acres of land, I think is what it was, 247. Was appropriate for the biplane. So you can do your flying there. You can take off and land. And to the north, it was relatively sparsely populated. But when you went to the south, of course, you were flying over downtown Dayton. Again, they didn't anticipate there was going to be a lot of flying going on here. It was mostly going to be people flying into it, and the testing is going on. It wasn't really going to be so much test flying like we think now. That turned out not to be the case, because again, they had anticipated this was just going to be a 1 or 2 year kind of thing, however long World War I lasted. But it turns out once the war ended in November of 1918, McCook Field was still up and running, and the Air Service had decided that while we're going to close all these schools and things, we still need an engineering function. We still need to be able to evaluate new airplanes. We still need to buy new airplanes. We need to keep this technical workforce together. So McCook Field, because of that unique mission, and this is literally the only place in the Air Service that's doing this, that it stayed open when most of the other places, especially the new ones that have been built during the war, most of those had shut down. So this one stayed open. But there was always the thought that, okay, hey, once someplace else is ready, we're going to move it. Well, oddly enough, what saved us was Congress. And they didn't mean to save us. By us, I mean McCook Field, the engineering division. What saved us was the fact that Congress didn't want to spend a single cent on the military at this point. They had spent, over $1 billion on airplane production alone. This was an unfathomable amount of money before World War I. We had never spent this much money from the federal government on any single thing. So for aircraft production, well, okay, we're not going to spend any more money. And so how does that affect McCook Field? Well, it costs money to move stuff, right? You've got to move test facilities. You've got to finish building new ones. You've got to move all of this stuff, by train or truck or whatever it is. And so it's going to cost, probably millions of dollars to recreate these functions in McCook Field somewhere else. Congress is like, well, we're not going to give you millions of dollars, so you're going to stay right where you are. So it was something like benign neglect is probably the best phrase to use that. So that's what saved McCook. But there were constant rumors about, okay, hey, next year we're going to move, because that land McCook Field was on was leased from year to year. They were paying something like, thousands of dollars a year to lease this little spit of land. But it was like, okay, well, we're going to go move south to where the Dayton Wright plant was to build aircraft. And in fact, they had stopped building lots of aircraft. They had built a few thousand airplanes during the war, but essentially stopped building most of them, except for just a handful of new types. And so there was a thought, well, McCook Field will just move down there. So it's only, 10 or 15 miles away. Great, we'll move that. I've actually seen plans for what they were going to do. Well, then the company that owned it didn't want to sell it. So that went by the wayside. They were talking about, well, we're going to move out to DC, we're going to move out to Langley, we're going to move out to Indianapolis. Like the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was actually like an air depot at the time. And so they thought, well, maybe we're going to move out there with the industry that's there. So all these different kind of arguments. But none of them happened because nobody wanted to pay for it. And so McCook Field just stayed there and stayed there and stayed there. And finally, things kind of came to a head, actually just a few weeks earlier, 100 years ago, just a few weeks prior to today, where they decided, okay, we need to do something. It's finally going to move. McCook Field's been open for 5 years. All of these buildings were built to be temporary. The test flying is getting a little bit dangerous. We've got 2 and 3 engine bomber and transport aircraft. These things that are too big and heavy to land within this spot of land that we have here. And in fact, that's why they ended up doing a lot of flight testing out at that old Wilbur Wright field next to Huffman Prairie. That's now Wright-Pat Area A. So they had moved all those large aircraft out there, and it was mostly the smaller ones that were still left here doing flight testing in Dayton, or in this section of North Dayton, I should say, as opposed to outside. Because now we think of Wright-Pat, it's sort of a suburb of Dayton, but back then, it really wasn't. It was next to 2 cities called Fairfield and Osborne. They're now the modern day Fairborn, another suburb now. But in any case, they had decided by 1922 that they did in fact need to move. And so the people of Dayton got really concerned that, hey, this function is going to be taken out of Dayton entirely and moved somewhere else. So they began a movement to try to keep that engineering division function in town. And this actually ends up being about a 2-year process. They get a group together of civic-minded citizens, the industrial types. They start a large collection of money. They get something like I think it's $700,000 worth of donations from the city of Dayton to go buy all this land that the old Wilbur Wright field had been sitting on and areas around that to donate to the government to use to relocate the new engineering division. And it happened because the Patterson family, as I mentioned, they'd gone to DC, they had talked to Congress, they had talked to the Air Service, and became very clear that, yes, if you want to keep this function is going to move, and if you want to keep it in Dayton, you guys need to donate land to the government. And then once you can do that, we'll keep it there. And so, this was fairly typical at the time. It's like, hey, people wanted these government facilities. Well, what you do is you donate the land. And so the government gets it for free. It's kind of like the tax breaks and things that happen now, right? When you want to relocate something. So this was kind of standard operating procedure back then. And so Dayton just got on board that. They collected the money, they bought the land. And then finally in 1924, so 2 years later, they donate that land to the government and they agree, okay, we're going to open this new field. We're going to move McCook Field across town. And that becomes Wright Field, which is later split into Wright Field and Patterson Field, and now the modern day Wright-Pat. Yeah. So very long-winded way to get to the flight testing part that we're going to talk about.
Right. So we're talking about an incident. You said earlier, this is the first parachute save of an aircraft that was crashing.
Yep.
But the story, the reason that it turned out the way that it did actually goes back to an earlier flight before that. So let's start with that flight beforehand.
Okay. Yeah. So parachutes were one of these things one of these technologies that was developed, well, really around the world, but the ones we're going to be talking about today were developed at McCook Field. Parachutes have been around arguably for centuries as kind of a novelty thing, or, for fun. They're most notably associated with, in kind of more modern terms, with ballooning. People would take, the kind of hot air balloons up for demonstration and later on for military observation. And at first it would be like, hey, we can jump out of a balloon basket with a parachute, and hey, this is a cool sight to see, right? We'll go charge people to watch this or whatever. Well, in military terms, we're using balloons for observation during World War I. You would send up a hot air balloon tethered to the ground to watch, over the front lines, over the trenches and that kind of thing. And then they would report down saying, hey, we see troops are moving here or there or whatever it might be. Well, these balloons, because of their importance for what we now call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, one of the early jobs of airplanes in World War I was to shoot these things down. And so we'd send airplanes against the other side's hot air balloons. Well, if you're a guy up in a balloon basket and you got an airplane strafing you, you want to be able to escape. So they would use those parachutes for that. But, and so the early parachutes were designed for that kind of function. They weren't so concerned about the weight or the size of them or even how you open them. So because they were on these balloons. And so all those things didn't really matter with the form, fit, and function, I guess, in kind of contemporary terms. And so literally what these guys would do up in these balloon baskets, they would have like a harness on, and the parachute would be in a bag strapped to the balloon basket. And then if their balloon was going to crash, these guys would jump out. Their harness would literally pull the parachute canopy out of the backpack and then open up, and then they parachute safely to Earth. So it's a relatively stable sort of thing, not a big deal. Well, it turns out for airplanes using that kind of parachute, what they call a static line parachute, is a little bit more problematical. Because you think when an airplane is going to crash, it doesn't do so in a nice controlled fashion, right? It's usually spinning or plummeting. So if you jump out with one of these static line types where your parachute's connected to a bag that's connected to the airplane, well, that can easily get wrapped up around the plane or get torn as you're jumping away. And in fact, this happened a lot. So parachutes weren't really seen as a very good technology. They were very immature at that time. The Germans were the early adopters of those. The British and French had a few. The Americans had none at all. And when Billy Mitchell, he's this guy that, if you talk about Air Force history, he's one of the big early air power advocate, but he's also in charge of the air component of the American Expeditionary Force out in France. Well, he sees other people using parachutes and he's like, hey, we need some of those too. So he assigns that job to a guy that's here in Dayton, that he happened to be, he was a pre-war parachute jumper, like one of these guys that was a stunt jumper. He would jump with parachutes for fun. His name was Floyd Smith, but Billy Mitchell knew him from past experience, and he happened to be in Dayton as an inspector at that aircraft plant in Moraine that I talked about. So Billy Mitchell puts him on parachute development. So he actually moves over to Wilbur Wright Field where they were doing the school and that test flying. And so he's experimenting with parachutes out there. When the war ends, he and his team moved to McCook Field, and that's where parachute development becomes a thing. So these guys, they actually bring in what you think of as like on-site contractors, right? So people who had from outside. So it's kind of a group of these on-site contractors, some government people and some military people who all get together and form this parachute team for development. And they pull in these kind of best ideas from foreign parachutes, from domestic ones, all the best things, and roll them into what becomes the Type A parachute. This becomes the first standardized free fall ripcord parachute. And their big conceptual leap, pun intended, was this idea of getting rid of the static line, where a guy who's jumping from an airplane can in fact open the parachute himself. And to us, this seems obvious, but back then, the kind of conventional wisdom was that when you were in free fall, you're either panicking or you pass out. So, it's like you'd be so freaked out by rushing towards the ground that you can't do anything sensible. You have no deliberate motion, right? So you couldn't open a parachute. So it had to be an automatic type system like these static lines, or else, as soon as you were in free fall, you would just pass out. And so you couldn't do anything anyway. And obviously you would plummet to the earth. Well, these guys who had been experienced parachutists, they knew that wasn't true, or they at least suspected it wasn't. And in fact, it was not true. You could very much maintain your own, faculties as you're doing it and open a parachute. And so that's what they put together, this idea of a ripcord where you pull the ring and it opens up the parachute out of the pack yourself. So what that gives you that critical ability to jump from an airplane that's out of control and to clear the airplane before the chute opens. So that will really get rid of all this entanglement problem that these static line parachutes had. So we here at McCook Field were really the guys to invent that technology. Did we originate it all? Were they the first ones to do all these individual pieces? No, but it's kind of a tangled web that's difficult to untangle. But the fact is, we were the first to put this all together into a package, standardize it, and actually produce it.
Yeah.
So,
but still, even at that time, some pilots weren't a big fan of these things, correct?
yeah, that's absolutely true. And this goes back to World War I, where we would see the Allied pilots would see the Germans use parachutes. They're like, hey, cool, we want those. But on the flip side, they would also see the bad parts of the parachutes. They would see the guys get tangled on their airplanes and then go down in flames, wrapped up, flapping behind their plane, going to their deaths. And that was, to them, that was a more horrible fate than just crashing inside your airplane, or trying to fight to the very end. So there was a little bit of that. So there's the trepidation about it. And depending who you ask, the statistics are anywhere from 30 to 70% failure rate for those World War I era parachutes. On the flip side of that, the leadership of the various air arms for all sides of the war were very hesitant to give their pilots parachutes. Why is that? Well, they thought that a pilot with a parachute would be much more likely to jump out of an airplane that he could have saved. So, the first sign of trouble, hey, I'm jumping out of here, and then you crash a perfectly good airplane or an airplane that could have been saved. So, it's like, well, wait a minute, we don't want our guys doing that. They can try a little bit harder to save this this valuable, expensive piece of government equipment, right? So that's number two. The third thing is, pilots probably even today, there's a certain, for lack of a better term, certain machismo that went along with that. And these were all men back at the time. It's, hey, it's cowardly to wear a parachute because, if you're a really good pilot or a really brave pilot, you're going to accept that danger. You're going to be able to land any airplane that's worth saving, right? So, only those bad pilots need parachutes. So, there's that sort of component to it as well. So you got this kind of threefold factor working against, the quick or rapid adoption of parachutes. And so there's always this hesitation, and that plays into it after the war. McCook Field ends up being a little bit different just because they're doing all this parachute development and testing right there. So all these test pilots that are working at McCook Field, even though they're not wearing parachutes, they're taking guys up to do experimental jumps. So they would fly up there, and then they might either throw a dummy out there with a parachute attached to it, or they later on, the parachute guys themselves, the development team, they were also the testers. So you'd have a guy sitting in your back seat who was one of the engineers that worked on a parachute, and he would jump and test that parachute himself. And the first one of these was done in 1919 by Leslie Irvin, who was one of these developers who was brought in as an outside contractor to work on site. He was the first one to make this jump with this free fall parachute after it had been tested hundreds of times. So, this had been a proven technology at that time. So the McCook Field guys at least had the advantage of seeing this thing work a lot. So that built up trust in the system, or at least a degree of trust in the system. So those guys would periodically wear parachutes, not regularly, not all the time, but they would when, they weren't as adverse to it as other pilots at other air bases or even in other countries might be. There was still one remaining problem, though. That was the integration of the parachute. It's not as simple, like including a parachute into an airplane isn't as simple as, hey, just throw the backpack on your back, go sit in the airplane, take off, and that's it. If you think about cockpits for biplanes, these are very, very small airplanes. And they were designed for just a guy sitting in a seat, maybe wearing, your high altitude flying clothing, so cold weather gear or whatever it might be, and so that's kind of it. There's not a whole lot of extra room, and so even like the most compact parachutes, once they started making them out of fine silk, were still pretty bulky. I mean, you're talking 6 or 8 inches thick, and something by like two foot by 3 feet in diameter. So not a small thing. So if you're sitting in a seat in a biplane designed not to have a parachute and you got a backpack on, well, you're smashed up against your control stick or up against the windscreen and the instrument panel. That doesn't work. One alternative to that was the development of the seat pack parachute. So that was, basically a cushion they would put the pack underneath you. So that was connected to your harness, but you'd be sitting on it. So that would go down first on your seat, then it was connected to you, and then you'd put your butt right on it, and then sit there. So that way it formed a cushion, so maybe nice and comfortable, more so than your seat. Well, we found out though that would also raise you up those 6 or 8 inches, and that might push you up above the glass windscreen in front of you. So then your head's sticking in the slipstream. And if you're flying at 125 miles an hour and you got this cold wind blast in your face, who's going to want that?
Right.
So there was all these sorts of negative things. And then you could say, well, all right, just put in a larger seat, or, cut out the back of the cockpit. Well, it's not that simple either, because you've got other things in the way, particularly the cables and things for the control system. Like, back then you're talking, actual like cables and pulleys and things connecting the control stick to the ailerons and the rudder and the elevators. And all those are running alongside the cockpit. So if you try to enlarge that to accommodate a parachute, you got to move all that other stuff out of the way. So it wasn't really a simple fix, and they hadn't really come up with that at this time, because the parachute had only been standardized as Type A since late 1919, and there weren't very many of them available, and they numbered in maybe the hundreds at that point. So there wasn't a lot of impetus to make all these changes necessary to integrate a parachute. So as a result, even at McCook Field, not very many pilots were wearing parachutes consistently. It would be periodically, but not consistently. And that brings us to the story that you brought up. So in March of 1922, so about 6 months before the event we're talking about today, there was a pilot, Frederick Niedermeyer. His nickname was Needy. He was a lieutenant in the Air Service, a very experienced pilot. And in fact, he was regarded as one of the best aerobatic pilots in the Air Service. So he had gone up on a flight test that morning. This was March, what I think is the 17th. And so he went up and did a usual test flight, and he wore a parachute, because these guys understood during flight tests, it's very likely that these experimental airplanes are going to break. So it's not like you're in a production airplane that's pretty consistent. The new stuff, is more likely to have a problem. So he had worn his parachute on this earlier flight. So when he came down and landed, he ran into a buddy of his that was out there, John McCready, who was actually one of the head test pilots there, another very experienced test pilot. So McCready says to him, hey, Needy, you want to go back up and do a little dog fighting? This was something they all loved to do. They'd take airplanes up and do mock dog fighting, up above, McCook Field and around Dayton and stuff. People on the ground love to watch these things, but it's a way to keep their skills sharp, to get their flying hours in and all of that. So Niedermeyer had literally just taken off his parachute and was, getting ready to take off his flying gear. He's like, sure, you know what, I'll go take another flight. So he grabs another airplane that's available. It's a Fokker V40. That's the prototype version of it. As a production airplane, it becomes the PW6. But it's a little bit of an odd airplane. It's a monoplane, what they call a parasail monoplane. So it looks like, it's got the regular fuselage, but the wing is on kind of struts above the cockpit. So it's not directly attached to the fuselage, but there's like actual struts on either side that are holding it up. So they call that a parasol monoplane. And I'll show you guys a picture of that here. But so he's going to take that airplane because it's ready to go. Now the stories kind of differ on what exactly happens next. So according to some people, he tries to get in the cockpit with his parachute on, but it won't fit. Because again, very small cockpit, and this one's probably especially small compared to some of the others, because it's a really small plane, one of the smaller ones they have at McCook Field. So according to some stories, he decides that, well, hey, I can't fit it, I'm just going to leave my parachute off, it'll be fine. According to other people, he was in a hurry. They said, hey, grab your parachute. He's like, I don't have time for it, it'll be fine. And then he gets into the airplane. Regardless of his motivation, he leaves his parachute off for this flight. Remember, he had just worn it, a few minutes earlier. Now he leaves it off. So Needy gets in the airplane. He goes up and does a little bit of dog fighting with McCready. They do some pretty cool stuff. Everybody on the ground, ooh and ah, they're doing this great dog fighting. And then, they're finally like, hey, we've had enough of that. It's fine. McCready goes to land. Niedermeyer, being again probably the top aerobatic pilot, he decides to do a few extra maneuvers on his own. And so it was during one of these maneuvers, he was doing he had done a barrel roll and was doing kind of a half loop out of that. And the reports are a little bit inconclusive on what happens, but basically the coverings on one of his wings starts to peel away. So there was probably a structural failure inside the wing. It was covered with a thin layer of plywood rather than fabric on the outside. So that begins to peel away. Well, he starts to lose control. The airplane starts to flip to the right side. He manages to correct it actually a couple times, but he starts to plummet. And each time he kind of pulls out, but he's rapidly running out of altitude. And this is just north of McCook Field in sort of a relatively unpopulated area, fortunately. But then finally, so much of the wing part pulls away that he can't control the airplane anymore. And interestingly enough, even in the accident report, it looks like he had pulled on the control stick so hard, it was a tube, that he had actually bent the control stick trying to pull up, but he just, without the wing coverings, there was no control there. So he hit the ground really hard and was killed on impact. But what they had decided afterwards, on how he had flown, if he had been wearing his parachute, there were definite instances, like I said, he had been able to pull out a few times, he was doing this sort of thing, that he would have been able to escape and save his life. But because he had made that fateful decision to leave his parachute off, that he perished that day. It just so happened that Niedermeyer, in his day job, he was the administrative assistant to McCook Field's commander, Thurman Bain. He had been in charge of the field since late 1918 and was arguably one of the most powerful people in the Air Service because he was in charge of all those functions I mentioned earlier. Well, he was very close to Bain, and Bain was really shaken up by this. He had sent a letter to his, very regretful letter to his family and all of this. And so just a few weeks later, he issues an edict saying that any pilot on any flight from McCook Field coming or going has to wear a parachute, no exceptions. If you don't wear your parachute, you don't fly. And so that becomes standard there. And so in this sense, because Niedermeyer died, he actually ends up saving the life that we're going to talk about for today's anniversary. But that was very much on everybody's mind.
So now we move forward to October 20th, 1922, and talk to us about that day.
Yeah, so this is, the circumstances here are oddly similar to what happened back in March. So here you've got a guy, Harold Harris. So he's actually chief of the flying section, very experienced test pilot. He had flown in World War I. He had flown the first attempt at doing a pressurized cabin airplane at McCook Field back in 1919. So he was, he had flown everything. Very, very experienced guy. So he's going to actually go up and do a flight test himself. I was going to pull up a picture for you, but I guess our listening audience can't really see that. But he's going to do the same thing as Niedermeyer had done. He gets invited up to go do a little dog fighting. So he gets in another monoplane. This is a kind of a standard monoplane, almost like, kind of a modern Cessna, not one of these parasol types where the wings actually attach to the fuselage. It's called a Loaning PW2A. Loaning was the manufacturer. So he's in that plane. The other pilot's a Lieutenant Muir Fairchild. He's in a more standard biplane, a Thomas Morris MB3A. It's a small production lot biplane. But the two of them are going to go up and do some dogfighting over McCook Field. That the Fairchild's airplane, incidentally, Fairchild later becomes a vice chief of staff for the United States Air Force. So he's actually stays in for a long time. So he retires as a four-star general. But he's kind of number one. He becomes the lead pilot on this flight. And Harold Harris, who doesn't do too badly himself in his career, he takes the loaning up. So these two guys go up. They take off from McCook Field, and if you look at the McCook Field map, so they essentially head south towards the city of Dayton, and they're gonna rendezvous for a little bit dogfighting. You got Fairchild in the front and Harold Harris behind him in this monoplane. So the thing about Harris's monoplane is it had what they called balanced ailerons. This was a kind of an experimental test. So, the ailerons are the bits on the ends of the trailing edges of the wings. So when these are what help you roll the airplane, like this, right? So if you want to turn to the left, you turn the control stick to the left. Well, what that does is it makes the ailerons move. So one side goes down, one side goes up. So that changes the way the lift is going over the wings. So that causes the airplane to turn. So as those ailerons move up and down, they go right or left. And that was the kind of modern equivalent to the old Wright brothers wing warping sort of technology. Well, these were set up in a way so that they were supposed to be, to match each other more closely, and they were weighted. Well, this turns out to be problematical because at certain speeds, the way the airflow goes over these and the way when they move at a certain angle, it causes something called flutter. So that means as the air is going over it, rather than going nice and smooth, it actually causes a little bit of a vibration, like an up and down kind of movement. Well, this essentially becomes a runaway condition. And so keep that in mind. So as these guys take off and Harris gets on Fairchild's tail, Fairchild's all right. Hey, we're good to go. He's behind me. Fairchild turns left. They're right over the river. If you look at the picture of McCook Field, they're right over the river heading to the east. And Fairchild turns left to kind of head generally back in the direction of McCook Field to go north. So Harris and his monoplane, the Loening, turns to go behind him, and suddenly the whole airplane starts shaking. So what happens is, due to this flutter, as the ailerons move, they start vibrating, and then they start vibrating more and more. So they're rapidly flapping up and down like this. So if you can imagine, a little bit of a turn makes your whole airplane turn. Well, if these ailerons are going up and down, then your whole airplane is trying to go like this. And so it's literally shaking, Harris to pieces. So he's in the cockpit, he feels this tremendous vibration. Remember how I talked about the control system where you've got cables and pulleys and things connected to those? Well, they're directly connected to the control stick. So the control stick itself keeps flapping back and forth between Harris's legs. So it's literally pounding the inside of his thighs. And so he can't even grab the control stick. It like smashes his hands, trying to get a hold of this thing, and it just won't stop. And he could feel bad things happening. And so meanwhile, on the ground, you've got McCook Field's commander, Thurman Bain. He just happened to be out there watching. And he was with a guy whose name sounds familiar, probably, Jimmy Doolittle, who was also a test pilot there at the time. He was also attending the engineering school. They're watching this dogfighting going on, and suddenly they see what's happening. They can't tell what's happening, but they can see the whole plane shaking. And then suddenly they see bits and pieces start falling off of it. And literally, a direct quote from Doolittle later on was Thurman Bain standing there looking up, and he sees what's going on. He's like, oh my God, and he's like wringing his hands, thinking that he's gonna die, that Harris is gonna die up there. And meanwhile, Harris probably thinks he's gonna die too, because he can't get control of his airplane. But as test pilots are, he's still cool, calm, and collected. So he realizes there's a problem here. It's probably with these ailerons that are the experimental piece. So he pushes in the throttle to slow the airplane. He tries to pull back on the stick again to slow it down, maybe get out of the speed that's causing this. Well, nothing works. He can't get a hold of the control stick very well to do it. And the airplane, like I said, pieces were shedding off of it, and his wing starts cracking. He knows that bad things are going to happen. So his airplane starts diving at about a 30-degree angle is what the witnesses say. And so he's plummeting. He realizes something bad's going to happen here. I need to get out. Well, because of Niedermeyer's accident back in March and Thurman Bain's edict that every pilot has to be wearing a parachute, Harold Harris was wearing his parachute that day. He's actually has the seat type parachute. He's sitting on it. And so he realizes, hey, I need to get out. There's no saving this airplane. So he'd actually never parachuted before. Some of the other test pods had tried it as, for fun, or, just to see what it was like, had jumped out of the back of airplanes and things, but he hadn't done it. He had flown for over 50 flights where the guy in the back seat had done these things, but he had never done it himself. But he had at least seen it happen. So he knew what he had to do. So as the airplane's diving, he was about 2,000 feet altitude at this point, heading towards a residential neighborhood in Dayton. His airplane's plummeting. He unstraps his safety belt. He stands up out of the airplane. As soon as he stands up, the air blast hits him. So it's like, that whatever the wind is outside plus his airplane speed is going over 100 and he estimates about 150 miles an hour. And so as soon as that air hits him, it sucks him out of the cockpit and he gets blown behind the airplane. So good thing for him. He doesn't hit the tail or anything. He's clear of the airplane. As soon as he gets out of the airplane, sure enough, that wing breaks off and the airplane plummets to the ground, and the other wing breaks off as well. So he doesn't actually see that happening because he's a little bit more concerned about himself. So after he gets sucked out, he's literally doing like a skydive maneuver. He's diving head first toward the ground and spinning because that's just how the wind had pulled him. So he's like, well, this isn't good. So he's like, I need to open my parachute right now. So I'll put a picture up on this later, but so he reaches down. The D ring, that's the ripcord ring, is like on your hip for these kind of parachutes. So you just got to pull that ring and it opens up the pack. a small parachute called a pilot chute opens up, and that pulls out the big parachute. That's how it's supposed to happen. Well, he reaches down, grabs the D-ring, pulls, nothing happens. Okay, well, maybe I didn't pull hard enough. He yanks it again, nothing happens. He's like, well, now I'm a little bit worried. Is my parachute faulty? He grabs it a third time, pulls it really hard, nothing happens. So he thinks, oh my God, I'm going to die here. Meanwhile, he's dropped from about 2,000 feet to almost 500 feet. Then he quickly realizes that, wait a minute, I'm pulling on the wrong thing. The way the parachute harness works is there's actually metal connecting rings that go over the top of your thigh, very near your hip, where that D ring is. And so he had, in his kind of flailing around, he had grabbed that. And so he was pulling on his leg strap there instead of the D ring. They felt very similar. And again, he's in a head first spinning dive. So you can see why there might be some confusion.
Sure.
So anyway, he's like, okay, well, I got it now. So he pulls the D ring. Sure enough, the pilot chute pops up. The big one pops up. It opens beautifully and perfectly. Whomp, it goes up. And I mean, you can imagine the relief he felt. Same thing for the guys on the ground. Doolittle and Bain are watching him. They see the chute and they're like, he just saved his life. And so sure enough, it slows him down, and then he falls. And both he and the airplane fall into this neighborhood of Dayton. By some huge stroke of luck, his airplane crashes into the backyard. There's into a backyard of a house. So there's actually a family in this house, the Klingmans. There's a father and son who had literally just been in the backyard. It's like a dad and his 5-year-old son had been out in the backyard, and then had just gone in the house when they heard this horrible noise. The airplane, as it was plummeting, literally scraped the side of their house, crashed through their backyard into the fence between there and their neighbor's house, and didn't quite explode, but it just, it exploded from impact, but not in a big fiery Hollywood sort of explosion. So if they had come into the house a minute later, they likely would have been killed. And literally one of the tires of the airplane crashed through the window of their house, landing just feet from the son in the dining room who had just gone in. Meanwhile, the mom was upstairs in the house. She saw through the back window this airplane crash in there and knew her husband and son had been outside, but she didn't see them. So she thought they were going to be killed. So, she, as she says it, she literally swooned and fainted, thinking that her family had just died. Fortunately, they had not. And the thing had missed, the houses entirely, but the gas and oil splattered everywhere, and luckily enough, did not catch fire. So, luckily for them, nobody was hurt. The worst damage was to this fence and to some landscaping, but it was certainly far less damage than what could have happened. So a few blocks away, Harold Harris parachutes down. He looks below, he sees what's happening. And again, you can't control this like a modern day skydiving thing where you pull on the cables and you can go side to side. You're kind of stuck landing where you're going to land. So he sees below him, in again, incredible stroke of luck, he sees a backyard grape arbor. So that's one of these things where it's like kind of a combination of a wooden lattice work and kind of wires that support grapes. So, you can grow the grapes and pick them and eat them, whatever. So he's going to land through that. He thinks, hey, this is great because that's going to cushion my fall. It's a lot better than landing on top of a house or in a tree or something like that. So sure enough, he crashes through this grape arbor, but unfortunately for him, beneath it was a brick sidewalk. So he lands a little bit hard, but he doesn't break anything, fortunately enough. So he's, as he hits the ground, 3 thoughts run through his head. And these are kind of direct quotes from him. The first was that, oh my gosh, I'm not dead. I'm not even seriously hurt. The second thought was, wow, I hope my airplane didn't kill anybody because I just landed in this neighborhood. And then the third thought was, oh crap, I just tore my pants. And he said that he was wearing his best pair of pants on that flight. And in the interwar period, as an Army lieutenant, you're not making very much money. So every pair of pants counts. You probably, have a couple of pairs and that's it. But so he had landed in this grape arbor. A guy who was living at the house, Mr. T.R. Best, comes out and sees what happens. He runs over to him and says that, hey, are you all right? And Harris is like, yeah, I'm fine, but just a little excited. So one of these kind of classic understatements. So yeah. Like anytime there's an airplane crash, you get neighbors rushing out everywhere, to come see what happened. So you got people going out to the plane crash site. You got people going out to Harold Harris's landing site. Pieces of the airplane had kind of scattered over this neighborhood. Oddly enough, one of the wings for the airplane had landed actually about a block from where Harris was in a schoolyard, right as school was letting out, but fortunately didn't hit anybody. But yeah, these school children for the Webster School actually saw the piece of the wing of the airplane land. Another one of the wings landed at a gas station nearby. So another bits and pieces that kind of sprinkled that area of Dayton. So it was just lucky that nobody had died. But it was because of this parachute mandate earlier that Harris had saved his life. So as far as we could tell, that was the first time that that the free fall ripcord operated parachute had saved a life. Well, there had been rumors that actually a year earlier this had happened with an airmail pilot, because a guy had jumped out of an airmail airplane and saved his life with a parachute. But it turned out on investigation that he had actually done it on purpose. He had crashed a perfectly good airplane just to be kind of the first guy to save himself with the parachute. So he doesn't count that for a real emergency situation. Yeah. But yeah, so because of this flight, and then a couple months later, a guy named Frank Tyndall, another Air Service guy in a different part of the country, same thing happened. His airplane crashed. He saved himself. And so in January of 1923, the head of the Air Service makes it mandatory that all Air Service pilots must wear a parachute on every flight, with a couple of exceptions. One exception was if the airplane won't accommodate it. And then the second was if a parachute has to be available. And then so in actuality, there weren't very many parachutes yet. So most pilots still weren't wearing them just because they didn't have access to them or they didn't fit in their airplanes. But from that point on, most pilots ended up wearing them. And then now, of course, everybody has ejection seats or parachutes, going throughout the war and World War II and all that.
So you mentioned a little bit about Harris. So what happened later on in his career? What came of him going forward?
Yeah, so he stays in for a good long time. He actually retires as a brigadier general. He has some stints in Dayton, but not all of those. But he later on gets out and he goes to work for Pan American Airways and actually becomes, I think, a vice president of some sort for them. So he has a pretty good career, but he lives a very long life. He doesn't die until the 1980s or 1990s. I think he's close to 100 years old. But he's another one of these guys that, like Doolittle, that lived a long time and was a very big advocate for Air Force history. And so he did a lot of talks about his experience as a test pilot and parachuting, all that. And he comes back from a Cook Field reunions that they have in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, he's very much still around, or he was very much still around for a long time. Mm-hmm. But he became sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll say he becomes the first member of what they call the Caterpillar Club. So he and a couple of Dayton Daily News guys come up with this idea of a kind of a fraternity of people saved by parachutes. And so everybody it starts out being company specific, but it's sort of a general thing now that everybody who's been saved by a parachute or now an ejection seat too becomes a member of this Caterpillar Club. So essentially every famous aviator you can think of is a member of this. And they call it Caterpillar because caterpillars produce silk, right? And that's what you're hitting the silk. It means jumping with the parachute. So you'd get a little pin with the little caterpillar on it. So but guys like Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, everybody who's had to eject from an airplane. The first President Bush, who had jumped out in World War II, was a member. And so it's still kind of this ongoing thing, this Caterpillar Club.
Wow, that's interesting. So going forward, as far as the parachutes go, how did this advance the cause? And I mean, was it a rapid spread of use of parachutes across the Air Force after this incident, or?
Yeah, it was really that it was the head of the Air Service, Mason Patrick, who after he did his January 1923 directive that everybody had to wear them, that kind of broke the ice. But from that point, it was more like, hey, we have to manufacture these in big enough quantities that people can do them. But that really started disseminating them all around. And it was this level of trust when it seemed that these parachutes had started to save lives. And when you're able to have parachutes that are small enough to fit in cockpits and not be terribly uncomfortable, that could fit with your high altitude flying clothing and all those things, that pilots started to adopt them. Would I say it's universal after that point? No, it still takes years for that to happen. But it really wasn't until later in the 1930s that you saw every pilot wearing parachutes for the most part. just because early on there's not even enough flying going on to really warrant this. And again, the availability of the chutes and the airplanes to accommodate them. It's not a, it's not a light switch you could just flip on that, hey, we saved these couple of guys, now everybody wears parachutes all the time. It was definitely a slow rolling process.
And did the technology, they continue to develop them? Did it advance rapidly, or was there like a long pause? How did it go as far as the technological development of the parachute?
Yeah, so that was it was an ongoing process, but it was probably more so at least in terms of standardized parachutes, it was iterative. It's okay, where can we make these small improvements to these? And that was a process of experimentation, but also adaptation. It's like where good ideas are coming from outside, or many companies were designing and building parachutes that they would bring to McCook Field to test. So sometimes they would adopt those, sometimes they would adopt bits and pieces from those to incorporate in the standardized one. But they're also doing a lot of real true experimentation, like completely different designs. Like, how can we design the canopy of the parachute to provide some maneuverability, for instance, or to have a greater load. They're experimenting with really some interesting things, like, can we attach a parachute to an entire airplane? So that way a guy doesn't have to jump out, because they're thinking about commercial purposes as well, right? If you don't want to have every passenger who gets on an airplane put on a parachute, right? So if airplanes aren't as reliable as you want them, well, can you just put a parachute on the airplane to parachute the whole thing to the ground? They look at breakaway fuselages. So, okay, well, if you can't save the whole airplane, how about a chunk of the fuselage, almost like an escape capsule? Put a parachute on that, then the rest of it will break away, and just that section will land. We tried that at McCook Field here. So lots of that experimentation going on. And that's something that the parachute work, I mean, we're doing that into the 1960s, certainly. We don't do that as much now, but over the decades, we're doing this for everything, like parachutes to drag chutes to slow down airplanes on landing. We're doing parachutes for weapons. Like if you're going to drop a bomb, how can you slow that down? Well, you can use a parachute. We're doing hypersonic and high-speed parachutes. Like, if you want to slow down something re-entering from space, how do you have a parachute do those speeds, like the parachutes that were used for the space program? A lot of that technology, and in fact, the very experts who were working on that had come out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base from their expertise. And then later on, you're applying those to ejection seats and all that. So yeah, there's constant research and development for those. And then you think about parachutes for paratroopers jumping out of the back of an airplane versus pilots who have to escape, and all these different applications. So that's the kind of work they're doing. It's like, well, what can we do with these? How can we improve the technology?
So this pretty much brings us to the end of our time to discuss this story. But before we go, I just wanted to mention, so you've got a couple of products that you guys put out on a weekly basis. Emails that you send out center wide. So if someone is interested in some of those stories, how can they sign up to get those? What's the best way? Is it to track them through our website, or? Yeah,
so we put out a product we call the Heritage Hanger that goes out to our workforce here. We take that content and it goes out on the AFLCMC website every week. We put the text and some pictures out there, and we also do somewhat truncated versions out on our Twitter feed. Our Twitter handle is at AFLCMCHO for History Office. We'll put the pictures out there and the text usually on a daily basis. And we also have another website at McCook Field where we talk about the events that happened 100 years ago on this day. So sometimes there's a lot of those, other times there's not so many. But for example, this story will go out on there later today. So that's really the best way to follow us.
Yeah, it's definitely a good follow on Twitter, especially if you like to see historic photos and get little bits of stories and things. Definitely good stuff that goes out on that feed. So
yeah, thank you.
So, sir, thanks very much for joining with us today and telling us about this exciting story and helping us learn a little bit about the development of the parachute and the first save here at Wright-Pat.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk history.
All right. Thanks.
You're welcome.